This week I'll be talking with Charlie Johns, who is the author of Neurosis and Assimilation, alongside being the editor of the Neurotic Turn. We'll be talking about neurosis and society. The first question is the revised Hermitix question, because a few people have said 5's too many and it was dragging on a bit, and I thought I still want it because I find the question interesting. So I've condensed it down now. So it's 3 thinkers, living or dead, in a room, having a conversation. You get to sit in there. Which 3 do you pick and why?
It's a difficult one because part of me just wants to watch certain philosophers because it would be really entertaining. But I think for a formal and like a didactic sense for me to learn something from, it would probably have to be quite boring, which would be Immanuel Kant with Hegel and possibly someone like Merleau-Ponty, I think, because...
It's like the phenomenology lineage there.
Pretty much, yeah. I think it would answer a lot of questions concerning, so you've got a Kantian critical perspective, and then Hegel kind of just brings stuff out a bit more, this idea of the absolute, and I think that would be really interesting to see how... And obviously his idea of infinity. And I think those two, although they're very similar, have lots, against each other. So they really need to hash it out. But I don't think there's been a proper hashing out because it's kind of unfair for Hegel. Hegel has the last say, right? Because Kant's dead and buried. But
I'm going to disagree with you there that Kant's dead and buried. I'm not sure we're
physically. Sorry. So he can't come back and say, "Well, hold on a minute." Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, Kant is one of mine actually. He's a strange chap, and I'd love to meet him. I think he'd probably be a bit weird, really really strange in real life though. So the conversation there would be to answer kind of pretty classic, almost classical now, questions of time and space. Then.
Transcendental inquiry, yes, but also I think, and this feeds into my idea of neurosis, I think, which is whereabouts do concepts come from, and it's the question of agency. So
yeah, this is a thing here. You've started with the word you put the word neurosis in there, and it's one of those terms that I think for people steeped in philosophy, the meaning could kind of mutate and change. So if you've read certain things, neurosis suddenly means something different. Mm-hmm. So perhaps you could explain maybe the classical meaning of neurosis, and then some of the transformations that you think are key in the word neurosis place.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that the ambiguity of the term should actually be seen as its strength. In the same way that philosophers still meditate on ideas of nature, subjectivity, being, neurosis, I would be as ambitious to put it in the same category because precisely it hasn't been able to be located empirically. It hasn't been turned into something that's falsifiable in a scientific way. So first of all, that's its strength, not some kind of postmodern ambiguity that we can just throw on anything or relativize completely, right? That's my standpoint. The simple answer to neurosis, there's lots of narratives, but the Western main popular narrative is it was instantiated by William Cullen around the mid-1700s. And he kind of described it as a general tension. And this is the type of classification of neurosis that I started with, which was there was a kind of alienation of the subject from society in a psychological sense. So, for example, that his or her thoughts weren't corresponding naturally to the environment. So we have a question of agency there, of whereabouts these kind of disturbing and compulsive fixating thoughts are coming from. But to be honest, like most things, you can bring the etymology and the origins of neurosis and more disturbances in the mind all the way down to the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
Because they were quite holistic in their approach. When they talk about world spirit, it also included the psyche. So, but it was really the mid 18th century where there started to be a kind of conflict. And that makes sense to me purely because of the cultural melee at the time, which is...
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think that the kind of almost conformity that comes from terms such as neurosis, maybe that has something to do with the process of the Enlightenment?
Well, that's interesting. I think that, first of all, neurosis for me is neither bad nor good. It's a capacity, a fundamental capacity to be able to have consciousness of the world. Now that becomes a bit metaphysical, but let's bracket that off for a second. The question then would be, at what point does that repetition of thought and fixation become unhealthy or healthy, right? And in the Enlightenment, it seems very strange that you have a whole epoch of thinkers who are completely fixated on certain thoughts, rigorous, disciplined, completely prioritizing the concept, for example, idealism, yet not wanting to describe their projects as neurotic. It seems like you can't have, you've got to have both. You can't have obsession of thoughts and the prioritizing of thoughts to such an extreme without also realizing that it might have other effects.
So if you're having a lock-in to idealism, materialism, rationalism, that you're saying is inherently a neurotic tension because you're locking yourself to one fixed point.
I think it's the locking, but I also think maybe it's also about what gets us up in the morning and what gives us influence, what are our passions. And I think these things have been moralized too much in a humanist world, when I think we should see that some of those reasons are actually should be seen in a more derogatory, well, not pejorative sense, that they're actual obsessions. So for example, things like we see the Beautiful Mind film and the Stephen Hawking's Theory of Everything film. Now, these films recently are disclosing the knowledge that these people that have done fantastic things in the name of science or mathematics, it's actually been down to more this physiological and psychological capacity to be obsessed with something and nothing else. And I think it's about time that we take on board the power of this type of neurotic thinking. And yeah, basically, instead of just suggesting that it all comes from just, just trying to discover the truth or some kind of form of discipline. There's a whole other thing going on.
So the other thing going on isn't passion or talent. It's by the sounds of what you're saying, an almost transcendental obsession.
Well, yes, I think that breaks into 2 points. Obviously, because I'm a philosopher, I have to try and find first principles to support my argument. So the first part of that is, how does consciousness work anyway? And that's a huge question, but let's reduce it down to you've either got some form of faculty, a priori faculty, let's say, in the mind that is inherently rational, which allows us to have unity of perception, unity of consciousness, memory, and so forth. Or on the other side, we have a kind of naturalist, materialist idea, which is there are things out there in the world that just are, and that because they just are, so the in itself, if you like, or just the things as they stand in a realist sense, then we already have that sense of unity and consistency because that's how the world is. Now, both of those arguments haven't been they're not very popular, either of those two, and I see the history of continental philosophy and post-structuralism as trying to answer the question of consciousness in a different way. So, for example, when Deleuze talks about difference and repetition, this is almost the prototypical of neurosis. He's looking for a new way of figuring out how experience, unity of experience, consistency, subsistency of experience works. And the way he talks about it is in a more inhuman and immoral way. Different mechanisms at work that aren't to do with rationality, and neither are they to do with some kind of physicalist world. So, in short, I believe neurosis, the capacity to fixate, is actually necessary for us to be able to live a life and to cohere with a world of symbols that we remember every day. So,
what's interesting though is, as you said about you think we should utilize that the capacity to be neurotic, to utilize neurosis as a means. Do you not think that wishing to utilize neurosis is in itself neurotic?
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that the wishing suddenly becomes kind of political as well, or psychological in the sense of a wish fulfillment. But I think the desire or the wishing has come about through an emergency of thinking because of the when we talked before about rough ideas for this, we were talking about capitalist realism. And the machinery set up is so asphyxiating that it's basically kind of is forcing subjects to think differently and rethink, and part of that is a neurosis for a new way out. But we've got to remember that capitalism, in the Deleuze-Guattari sense, is great at appropriating all things from the outside, and it's appropriated neurosis. And the way we navigate on a day-to-day is through obsessing about social status, monetary status, sexual status, career status. All these things are semiotic. They don't exist as properties. They're all I would say neurotic constructs. So capitalism has appropriated neurosis very well, and we all abide by these things without too much, rebellion. So neurosis was bound to happen when some of those things weren't going to fit with our lifestyles, and the neurosis is also a type of answer to use that power to rethink, as Nietzsche said, to reevaluate all values.
The reevaluation of values is an interesting point, because when you say something's got value, there's clearly, maybe you'll disagree, but there's clearly at least even a semiotic or a symbolic structure has been built there historically over time. So the big question with this is, if capitalism is reterritorializing neurosis in a way in which people begin to fixate on structures of its own, structures which support it, structures which help it and propagate it, isn't the just continual deconstruction of structures, which often, it flows, this deconstruction flows out from these structures into everything. Isn't that a kind of main line to nihilism? Isn't that seriously unhealthy in the long run?
Not really, because I think if you take meaning seriously, then you want to discover it. Now, and it's very difficult to discover meaning in capitalism, because majority of meaning in capitalism is contextual. For example, going into Marx with an idea of exchange, a certain object means something in relation to how much it's worth, its equivalent value, or or because it's been made by that certain person, that relates to some kind of authenticity. Now, I think that's looking for meaning which goes past that is very valuable. I don't think that's nihilistic. I mean, for example, this might sound a bit antiquated, but when we talk about the big things like love, God, freedom, those three things can't have an equivalent to something else. You don't look for something that represents God or something that represents love. You say you have it.
Well, in terms of deconstruction, the capacity to love could be deconstructed into simple chemistry, I imagine. As for God, you could deconstruct that historically. This is what I mean is once everything gets thrown into this thresher of deconstruction, and I guess, not to sound too Peterson-esque, but postmodernism, it sort of just begins to atomize into, and it's yet to find its terminal, like, microform, like the smallest thing you can deconstruct it down to. So, like, wherein is the justification of transgression of current structures?
Well, okay, that's taking a different
Marxist revolutionary sense.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, because I'm kind of on your side there. That I mean, let's not turn it into a Jordan Peterson, conference, whatever, but conversation. But he's got a point when he talks about the fundamental requirements of hierarchy. But we're not. Let's get this straight. I'm not saying let's all go and do whatever we want. I'm suggesting that the initial structure of meaning itself, at least historically in the last kind of 500 years, I'm being very vague here, is set up on a symbolic stage. And I think neurosis in a neutral sense, not bad or good, has a lot. Neurosis is part of that structure, that symbolic structure, which allows us to relate and react and have reflexes to that symbolic world that we live in. So first of all, I'm saying we might not need to have an alternative, but let's first suggest that neurosis is a condition for that structure. And then I'm saying I'm not really like a kind of this radical thinker. It comes from my philosophical idea, which is simply, I call reality tautological, which is very similar to kind of what capitalist realism might be describing, which basically means X equals X. If I see a cup, then the concept cup exists and I use it as a cup. If I see a red light, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of Straussian semiotics here. We have the capacity, I believe, in a good old-fashioned idealistic sense, that we can change the meaning as uses of objects through appropriating different concepts and things like that. So what I'm interested in is not necessarily a transgressive alternative, but just trying to kind of experiment within the confines of what we've got.
Mm-hmm.
There's
a great quote in relation to Wittgenstein. I don't think he said it, but someone said it about him, where a broom, the use of a broom is different when you want to sweep the floor and when you want to break a window. The appropriation of the object in context. But I feel that that's a pretty limited scope, though.
I think there needs to be a two-sided perspective on that idea. Yes, it's limited because it feels like it's just some kind of wordplay, use play on an object. That can just change one thing to another and not really do anything drastically important. But we've got to remember that not only can we change the use of a broom or something, but it's predicated that we respond to our environment as those things. So this is when determination comes in. We are determined by those current uses. Let's say it's a kind of or an order of meaning, an order of signs. And I think we could maybe try to experiment with how we react to those, not simply just creating new ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to. I mean, we really are extremely determined by when I walk into a room. I'm not having to think. This is kind of a Heideggerian idea, really. I'm not really thinking about how I'm maneuvering around the objects, how I'm sitting on a chair, how I'm using my breathing functions, how I turn the light switch on, how every object that I engage with is a kind of one-sided engagement. The contract is not reciprocal. It's demanded of me through those objects. And that can be really problematic because the exaggeration of that is that we just become blind to the meaning as uses of objects and just go around and they kind of have they have their revenge on us, and we even treat ourselves as objects among other objects. And I think this is what mass conformism is, and I think this is what capitalism. We've got to look at philosophical problems in capitalism, not simply political ones, right? And the determination of objects through their use, which is basically a kind of pragmatism gone mad, is creating a type of somnambulistic, zombie-like culture.
Yeah. So then the key question is, how does neurosis help the zombie?
Well,
is that the cure?
The great thing with neurosis is that it's not something that you kind of instantiate by yourself in a good old kind of Cartesian way, like when Descartes says, "I think, therefore I am." He's kind of got this self-causing idea of thoughts. Now, you're going to get people, this is where maybe the traditional idea of the neurotic comes in. You're going to get people that just start to have thoughts that aren't, as I would say, tautological. They start to see the cup that their grandma gave them, for example, that they just take out in the cupboard, from the cupboard. The chap starts to see this cup and remembers that his grandma is dead, and that they used to flick, let's say, coins into this cup, and suddenly this cup has become a completely different symbolic object, and he doesn't want to drink out of it, and if he does, maybe he tastes copper because of this idea of the past. This is exactly what we were talking about a few seconds ago with changing meanings of objects, but it's something that just comes because concepts don't always fit nicely together. Another example is you maybe have a girlfriend who you fall in love with, and then you find out that girlfriend has had sex with your twin brother or something. Now, that you're going to have a conflict here, whether you like it or not. The world isn't a nice, tidy place, and those sorting through those concepts, or simply the animated tension between those concepts, will become apparent. So I think it's going to happen whether we like it or not. This is what neurosis is. It's the residual symbolic and conceptual nature of things when they're not tied away.
Right. So then, almost, I mean, this is. I have to alter the question a bit, because it's obviously the classic question would be, what do you do with those who can't fit in? But I would alter that to say, so then what do you do when someone's neurosis takes them down a path wherein they can no longer assimilate into society? But philosophically, what do you do with that being?
Yeah. I liked how I used the word assimilate there. Bonus points, because I use the word all the time. And you can see how they play off each other, right? There was a general structure that relates, and then...
it's an academic word. You put it in essays a lot and you sound smart. It's great.
Well, maybe I should be more specific. I can see. But I have to use certain words because certain ontologies haven't got it right. I'm all for ambiguity, Assimilation doesn't necessarily mean causal determination, and it doesn't necessarily mean a rational capacity. So I'm looking for something. I actually started reading a lot of Manuel Delando and Jane Bennett recently, and they're a bit more on my wavelength here. They talk about certain determinations, but that's another point. So what happens to the neurotic when they become alienated from that assimilation? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's the philosophical problem there? How because the I don't want to go down the political route because that's a question of rehabilitation, blah blah blah. That's probably been talked about to death. Well, what's the philosophical point there? What's happening there?
Well, the philosophical point is neutral, and I'll always have to say this, that I don't think philosophy cares too much about right or wrong or politics. I always say that from day one. Obviously, it feeds into it. You can have neuroses that are moral and immoral. But capitalism itself is highly neurotic. So that's just obvious to me. Just through the sheer amount
of... the dual pincers of Deleuze and Guattari's detailization and retailization are just kind of a fluxing neurosis of economy.
Yeah, pretty much. That's not eloquently said, yeah. So that's obvious to me. So it would just be if someone is alienated from that, they're still using the neurotic capacity, but the excess of meaning as Deleuze and Guattari talk about, that tries to be captured. Yes, there's going to be a point where they're going to feel traditionally depressed, alienated. That's something that I can't quite. I don't know how to talk about that, because I would suggest that those feelings are actually constructions based on, the way that society is.
Okay, so attention against that which is, supposed of you.
Exactly, yeah. So I think, and also the questions that I don't really have a kind of way out. I'm a bit like Nick Land here. There was no level 2 to it. It's just, I can't give an answer to what those people should do, but I can tell them that what they're dealing with is part of a very, for lack of a better word, natural process, and they shouldn't feel alienated because their values are different to others. The question for me would be finding within the main tautology of capitalism, eking away those things that look necessary and finding out that they're not. They're to do with actually indexing concepts onto things.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned Land there. Do you think there's a means to utilize neurosis as a means of acceleration?
Well, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the Neurotic Turn that I edited was going to have a Nick Land essay in. I was talking to him quite a lot, and he did send me an essay, and I really enjoyed it. And I think we're going to use it. Me and my team at the Centre of Experimental Ontology in Lincoln are going to use that paper for something. And it was, so there's a direct correlation, because he seemed very enthusiastic about this, and he described it in the similar way that you're saying. The need to accelerate. I think neurosis is innately an accelerationist capacity. But the thing is, let's not be too naive. You can accelerate something to such an extent that it becomes extremely static. So you can accelerate thought to such an extent to see the world as a certain thing. And it takes all your energy and all the hyper speeds of thought to fixate in order to create that sense of status quo, So we don't want to make the mistake that acceleration is simply one-sided, where it goes beyond the status quo. Acceleration is also maintained to preserve it. right?
Yeah, it takes a certain amount of energy to neurotically escape the human, and eventually it kind of always drags you back, which would imply that there is some back, but is that itself a structure? But this is again is getting into pure land stuff, because this is simply what the human security system, is that's the the means of escape from that is kind of I guess you'd say hyperneurosis,
Mm-hmm. Well, all I'm saying is it works both ways. I think the idea of a human natural subject is extremely neurotic. I think it's a argument that has been instantiated over and over again in order to create a sense of its validity. And that happens in philosophy all the time. Philosophy is a competing arena of neuroses, a competing arena of opinions, not only opinions that try and argue, but also opinions that try and maintain a certain idea of something. Right? And this goes back to the idea of tautology. So in the Landian, I'm not as materialistic as Land, and I empathise with Kant is probably most important philosopher still for me to this day. I'm more thinking about.
I don't know if I'd classify Land as a materialist. He mentioned in my interview with him about time. The future doesn't come from the present. The present doesn't come from the past. So, that's not strictly a materialist position.
Well, yeah. Well, I think it could be. We have so many different ideas of materialism now. I think neo-materialism. I think that's difficult to hash out, isn't it, right now? But I think if there's a kind of causal loop from the future, let's say, to a present, then that still could be a material. That could be a material that's just unbeknown to us that we haven't figured out yet. So I'm suggesting that there is a million ways to think the subject. And actually, if you look at the history of philosophy, it's pretty, this is maybe a bit like Eugene Thacker, even though I'm not completely, what's the word? I don't know his work too well, but you can look at the history of philosophy. I think he says as a kind of horror, right? Horror narrative. And I think you can do the same thinking about neurosis. You've got Descartes, who thinks that there's some kind of neurotic devil doubting him all the time. You have various different constructions of the subject. And we haven't got there yet. So the question is, that power to rethink the subject is extremely scary and interesting. And I think neurosis is
the realization
to do so.
of one's compulsion towards such structures as subject, that in itself is a process of a horror process, a process of horror to realize the kind of continual maze of locked doors, dead ends that you and you're never going to not end up in a dead end. That's horrifying.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's the unheimlich. There's no really home within a home.
So then, what is the task there of deconstruction? If they're acknowledging this, if this has been acknowledged many times, that do you simply kind of almost combine, Deleuze and Guattari's concept of the nomad with a heightened neuroticism and just continually move from point to point to point to point, attempting to never stagnate? But then that process in itself is once again a neuroticism. So, answer my own question.
It kind of goes back to my point of I'm just trying to disclose the capacity. I mean, for me to suddenly say that's the right way to do it or that's the right way to be neurotic would just be idiotic, wouldn't it? It's kind of like saying, how should physics be or something? Like, it just is. And I don't know, but that's probably a bad example, but you can see where I'm going, right? And then it's up to us to add a secondary quality to that or add a secondary reason to that.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So what's if you don't mind me asking, since you've delved into this, what have you figured to be your personal your personal relation to your own neuroticism, where are you taking it? And just as an example to what one can do.
Where am I taking? Well, at first I was simply interested in a phenomenological perspective on capitalism. So it's quite safe, normal student academic thing. I wasn't trying to be too out there or anything. I was trying to suggest that using Sartre's first kind of dictum when he talks about the only thing that has existence which precedes essence is us human beings. And he started using that in a kind of Promethean, liberating way. But also that means that 99.9% of everything else in the world has a concept there before it, which therefore means it's going to have a preordained sign. So then what happens is you're going to have a determinism, because everything else, Hoover didn't start being and then suddenly we had the concept Hoover. We had to put the concept there first. Everywhere we look,
Hoover in the world.
yeah, everywhere we look, it's all there meant for us, which means everywhere we look, it's already going to have a relation to us based on that way. So I wanted to explain that the power, it's kind of slightly object oriented, but let's not go too far that way, which is that the reality is made of these chunks of these types of tautological objects. For example, and this is very Graham Harman-esque, when a chair falls over, it falls over as a chair. It doesn't fall over as atoms and particles or some kind of empirical quality. So there's something interesting happens there. You have a vitalism or kind of animism where not only do we have objects that are meant to be certain things for us, they start acting in relation to other objects as that thing as well. He talks about fire burning cotton and fire only relating to certain parts of the cotton and things like this. Now, things are relating as these tautological objects, whether we like it or not. So that was the first point, and it was a criticism of capitalism, because I basically equated capitalism with the idea of this tautology, because they want to have a smooth operational space. And then I realized that through the power of philosophizing, constant philosophizing, which, yes, you could see as deconstruction, sure, infinite deconstruction of meanings and concepts, I started seeing that as neurotic. And that, to me, that makes perfect sense. I just think it's maybe we just haven't got quite far enough. We're a bit too humanist yet. I think that the idea that we have thoughts, whether we like it or not, and the idea that we can fixate and meditate upon thoughts for a very long time is obviously, well, to me, it's closer to an idea of neuroticism than any other form of thinking in Western.
Yeah. Like most philosophical lineages and roots, I kind of see this heading back towards the general concept of death and mortality, because as you say, to paraphrase Land here from our interview, we don't know what the human or the human is, or humanism is yet. It hasn't formed itself, perhaps because, and this isn't Land, this is me, but perhaps because it has yet to have a truly neurotic tension. We haven't had AI yet. We haven't had, and I'm delving down into the labyrinth of conspiracy theorists, but we haven't had things like AI and aliens or mass catastrophic events which truly put a frame on humanism. We've had like a fairly pleasant linear ride as humans.
That's interesting because I think the state of play at the moment in this Landian sense is that capitalism uses us only as neurotic subjects, i.e. it doesn't need us to have morals or any form of like those natural or traditional baggage of the human. It just needs us to respond to desire in certain ways and to conform, to buy this, to buy that, to be a slave to this or that. So the subject in the moment, if I can be so ambitious, the current subject is neurotic in the sense that it has been reduced simply down to itself being an object within that circulatory system. Now, if new AI and all these other things, if they're going to come about, it's probably not going to come about through capitalism in the sense of the safe the safe capitalism, because it won't want, unless it can appropriate. Because what I'm saying is it's going to come from people, individuals, neurotic individuals that are looking for landscapes outside of that horizon, right? And they're going to be, I think this is my point, that I think these individuals or collectors or societies, let's not forget that intelligence is not really owned by capitalism. It's owned more, it's something that's actually tries to be oppressed, right?
You just cut out for a second there. It's something that
intelligence itself is something that's not really it's oppressed by capitalism because it only wants a certain amount. If it has too much,
yeah, I was going to say, but ironically, it's also its greatest asset in terms of its own structural becoming.
Structural, well, just structure. Yeah, I know, but I think it's a different intelligence. That's a different conversation. I think intelligence that's simply pragmatic is not complete intelligence. I think intelligence needs, in a Kantian sense, the sensibility and imagination, all these other things. The artistic tendencies are less valued. An obvious example of that, is just a really boring example of that, is just all the cuts to all artistic institutions. But if there's going to be a tension between these new horizons, that'll be interesting, because where does the neurotic subject fit in then? Will capitalism seems to be able to appropriate everything that we throw at it, so it will probably do the same. Won't it? Maybe this is Nick Land's point. But
what's interesting here is the language you use is, as far as I can see, sort of kind of 80% Heidegger. So what was his conclusion be here? Because it's clear to me that you've used a lot of Heidegger. The neurotic being you speak of is thrown into the world of symbols, and his key concepts, such as the ready at hand, are they breathe into this very, very easily.
Well, yeah, maybe I'm just kind of jumping on the Heidegger bandwagon. Who knows? But I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to just carry on trying to teach Heidegger's ways. I mean, the present at hand is exactly the tautological sphere. It's the things in the present that mean something in a certain situation. But I would argue that the ready to hand, which is the world of non-theoretical description, which is just the world we live in, is equally just as determined by concepts. Just because we don't think about it and turn a door handle doesn't mean that that's some kind of primal structure of being. It just means that we've become so determined that it's a tacit reflex, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I disagree to some extent with his idea of a general primordial being underlying things. But the threefold structure of being thrown into a world of acting on the plane of immanence, and then projecting that into the future, is where I start, really, with just a general, just with the subject, basically, and its orientation. But then I begin to start worrying about this idea of the projection into the future, because what future, and does it exist?
Yeah, I was going to say that's already a neurotic belief and faith in history.
And even more... I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying you're already reliant on history, and from history is just a continuum of different structures. So you're reliant on so much as soon as you posit a historical being.
You do, and this is where I don't like Heidegger, really, but it gets just as scary and weird when you think about the being thrown into the world as wrong as well, because this is extremely skeptical, but we don't really know. We have memories of a past. I'm not saying the past doesn't exist, but we have memories of a past, and that's all we get to deal with on a phenomenological level. We don't get to deal with the real existent lives of whatever that past is. So it's actually all immanence.
No, and also with regard to Heidegger, the word past has some difficulties because you, as your past existing as memories is consistently only the present. There's no literally that there never is a past kind of.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like a recollection of a recollection. That's what a memory is, but it's existing in the present because you're always thinking of the past now. Heidegger said you're always pushing it in front of you.
Absolutely. And I think there might be more to be said there. In my new book, which will be out in a few months, I call it memory space. I'm sure that's been a term that's been used before, but now I'm interested in, well, how do institutions or capitalism, if we can be vague, how do they mobilize a memory space, not just a space that's determined, not just a way to maneuver around and have reactions to symbols, but also how do they embed a sense of memory in that space? And that becomes interesting because if there were no memory, then you kind of would have constant revolution, right? You need to, if you woke up one day and didn't and realized that all laws were maybe yesterday, but yesterday doesn't exist anymore, then anything goes. So there has to be some kind of enforcement of memory every day for things like etiquette, very simple things. That's becoming more and more interesting to me. I think we're leaving out that idea and there's space for it to be filled.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's interesting. That's an interesting critique of Heidegger, anyway.
Thanks.
Is there any other directions you'd like to take this in?
Well, I think I do have a knack of being a bit obtuse, and I think the going back to where I was going with neurosis, as I said, I was starting with a phenomenological description of a world, and I realised that maybe neurosis was a way out of deconstructing the historical contingent frameworks of a society. At the same time, I found out that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders made neurosis redundant in the 1980s. So obviously, the first question is, well, what's going on? And it doesn't take a lot of research to realise that the term basically just was too elusive for the type of clinical psychology at the time. There wasn't necessarily a causal reason for neurosis. It couldn't be found in a kind of neurological materialist like place or symptom in the brain or something. So there's obvious reasons why it didn't fit with this kind of pseudo.
They fragmented it.
They fragmented it. In what sense?
Fragmented neurosis into a plethora of other conditions. I imagine anxiety, depression, social anxiety, etc., etc. I mean, surely in this way of looking at things, one can only then see that the atomization and fragmentation of neurosis is simply a means to a more efficient means of herding meat puppets.
That's interesting. I would say maybe it was down to just the ontological capacity of neurosis itself. Like surely what happens when you repress neurosis itself? That's basically what happened. You have a whole society saying, no, let's put that all the way over there. Like, even if we've learned anything from people like Nick Land, people like Bruno Latour, people like Graham Harman, we realise that things that aren't necessarily real, quote unquote, still have immense signifying
reality
capacity. Yes, exactly, reality. So if 100,000 people think about a certain, goddess or thing, then it becomes part of their social fabric. And neurosis is exactly that. And to just try to throw it away is going to be dangerous because you're repressing a symptom that naturally will never stay repressed. Not only that, the more of the conspiratorial take would be that it had to go because we realized that the things that were meant to be healthy, the to sound a bit stereotypical, but the bourgeois white working man with a career and with goals is a neurosis, i.e., it's not a substantial enough meaning to do it. It's not. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, it's not. Why? What's the final meaning behind doing that? Going,
Get a nice car.
Well, this is it. I know now I'm sounding nihilistic, but I don't think I'm being nihilistic. I think I'm being idealistic and suggesting that there are ways, there are more meaningful ways than, just the repetition of buying products. So
this is where the relation to objects comes in. You could use Marxist language here and say the fetishization of objects is a means to neurotic control in a way. So maybe this is at heart a materialist debate.
Well, what is material? I think becomes the question. And I think it's still stuck in conceptual classifications of matter. So I don't believe in some kind of naive actual matter that's going to rear its head and we can all go, yes, that's the final product. The constant mutability of matter through concepts is what I'm interested in. But the conspiratorial part is exactly that. Like, maybe we just realised that if we kept neurosis, we'd all be neurotic, right? Because that term, if you read it in the Diagnostical Statistical Manual before 1980, it applies to every single one of us because we are spurred on, engaged in highly symbolic modes of production without any recourse to a natural means or on reflection. It's on reflection, it seems absurd. And that's an obsession. It's an absurd obsession absolutely absurd obsession to wish to, it's involuntary work, compulsory work every day, from 9 o'clock in the morning or earlier till 5 o'clock, to then have one leg come out of the working assimilation straight into the leisure assimilation, which is created in exactly the same way, which determines us, which gives us drink to try and relax us. This is a psychological point that Freud talks about when he talks about the pleasure principle. It's a cathexis. It's they create the stress and then they determine means of how it can be alleviated. And that's what we do. And that's pretty much part and parcel our society. And that's neurotic. So I'm saying, in a conspiratorial way, that we had to basically just said that neurosis doesn't exist. So then we're not neurotic. We're just the right thing.
So those who go to the doctors for depression can't simply say, well, I don't want to work. That's not what I want to do with my. It's not what I want to do with my finite time. And then the answer is, well, you have to. So here's X that makes having to do that to survive bearable. I mean, that's not a world I'm actually too sympathetic to. I'm kind of for work as long as it's not kind of bureaucratical nonsense.
Well, yeah, and I probably be a bit more lighthearted as well when it comes to the work being naturally healthy and so on and so forth. But what are we doing with all these qualities? Let's go along with what I'm saying. All these neurotic capacities, like what are we doing with them? We're just tautological reality represses all forms of different conceptual association. It just wants you to see car, go into it. Now you're a car driver. Then you go and play tennis, and you become assimilated by a tennis court. You're a tennis player.
I think a lot of them are probably almost physically repressed to behind closed doors. I mean, I've never been to a new friend's house where they didn't have some strange thing that they did that was specific to their house that they just always did. Like, I've never met anyone who wasn't a bit weird.
Yeah.
And it's the hiding of that.
Okay. That's interesting because you've also got at the same time, in the last 20 years at least, this massive neurosis for a fake type of authenticity. So have you noticed this? People want to have tattoos in certain places. They want to say everyone now wants to go and live. They want to go on holiday and see the whole world. They want to. Mm-hmm. They want to listen to this specific type of music, and they want to tell everyone that this type of specific. So this is quite depressing because it's basically just saying that capitalism's won again. It's giving you the illusion that you're trying to be unique and live an authentic life.
If something's working, then capitalism's winning.
Well, yeah.
And if it's not working, it's gone.
Straight away, yeah.
There's not, or it's a very, very, very tiny, stagnant population somewhere that no one knows about, because as soon as they connect back into the circuitry, it either gets subsumed or it gets destroyed because it's of no use. So that's.
But who cares about use? I mean, that's one of my least favourite terms. It seems to be a priority for everything now, the use. I've become quite interested in anoraks. People, these are high neurotic in the sense that they collect, in a Marxist sense, they collect, let's say, old toys or figures from the 1950s or 60s. Now, there's no innate value to these pieces of plastic. They probably cost 5p. Another example is record collectors. And the vinyl costs maybe even less, 2 or 3p to make vinyl. It's all simply... Nostalgia plays a part, sure, but it's all highly symbolic, and they live in that world. And to the point where I would go as far to say, when it comes to relations with other people, they try and find a way to put that neurosis onto other people. They say, "Oh, by the way, this is what I'm into." You know, how incredible is that? It's interesting starting to see interrelations based on my kind of general idea of neurosis, because you have to basically start thinking, like, what are people's passions, enthusiasms, their esoteric, like enthusiasms are all, you can't separate the subject from them anymore. They identify with these neuroses, and that becomes
identities.
Identity is a construct, even if Jordan Peterson wants to criticize me. That becomes interesting.
Perhaps we just need to take some responsibility.
That's Peterson, isn't it?
Yeah, that was a Peterson joke. Sort yourself out.
I think my main criticism, which is not even to do with philosophy anymore, is that I know so many people who are saying, I do what I like. I'm doing everything I want to do.
No, you don't.
They don't.
And you don't want to be the party pooper, but all you're thinking is, no, you don't.
Yeah, and it's easy and it takes a really strong personality to. It's maybe sounds bad, but a Christian idea. You have to accept your own humility. Like maybe you and I maybe we're doing a little bit more than some other people, let's say, but we have to accept our humiliation that we're still not doing it.
I'm still subscribing in doing this podcast and doing my blog to an identity of, a kind of almost a myth of intelligence. I know that in the back of my mind. It takes something to accept that, but I mean that applies to everything. You could apply that to every meal. Has some form of identity that you're like, you're eating some Mediterranean food and you're subscribing to a certain vision in the back of your mind.
Absolutely, but then the power to maybe for a child to be at the dinner table and start using the prawns on the plate and starts using them as a toy or wearing them as earrings. Now that might sound absurd, but inside that, something philosophical is happening. Something, the status quo of the use, which includes the social use, because you're in a restaurant and there are certain rules in a restaurant. This is a Wittgenstein idea, really, like with language games. And to through their neurosis, which is through their own creative mind, which is infinitely deconstructive of all things, they can create. Yes, it's quite a predictable alternative to eating the prawns, but still, it still involves the capacity to reappropriate. And
so then they reappropriate the naughty step, and all punishment is lost.
Are you saying that's a bad thing?
No, I'm saying what happens when the prisoner reappropriates the prison to be paradise?
this is it. I don't believe there's any like outside real freedom. If the prisoner wants to construct his own, it's not even an imaginary thing anymore. It's his own conceptual relation to his environment can be reappropriated to such an extreme sense, then that becomes it. There is no real outside. There is no real freedom. So if that's true, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, it has to then become about ways in which you twist and turn the mechanisms inside to suit or not suit you, and to find. I think maybe this is my artistic nature, because I did a BA in art, so a Goldsmith. That I think it's an aesthetic criteria. That is, it might not be any good or bad or even social progression. It's just simply the experimentation. But I think there's something healthy about experiment. I mean, this is Nietzsche for me. Like, experimentation is a form of freedom, basically. And experimentation is a way to fit something for you, which was maybe previously not for you. To find a way to identify with something is an extremely healthy thing. And I think we're all a bit too ill because we're done trying to appropriate. And I know there's this criticism of, I feel like maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like maybe the elephant in the corner is, well, we've been doing the deconstruction thing, right, for whatever, 60 years, and it's not.
Yeah, it hasn't worked out too well.
Well,
he says quietly.
Yeah, exactly. I can't think of a more, this is on tape, whatever, I can't think of a more productive 50, 60 years than the ones that were the deconstructive epoch.
I've got a book you should borrow. It's called The History of the Victorians. I think that was a great 50 years.
The history of the Victorians, what? Sorry?
No, just the history of the Victorians. It was just a joke about the productivity. I mean, what you consider productivity. Okay, sure. I mean, in terms of philosophy, maybe. I mean, how do you gauge that?
Well, I think you gauge that by looking at. Give me a second. I think the immense amount of freedom of thinking. I generally still think, and from the analytical school down, there has always been schools of thought. There have always been doctrines, and I think in the 1950s, 60s, I've never seen in the history of philosophy, I don't think anyone's ever seen such a giant multiplicity of thoughts. I really don't. I think to go from language theory to, if they want to go to embodiment theory, to new materialisms, to, technology, Simondon, to, I mean, I'm saying that these are all gathered around that time. They might not be writing at a specific time, but that's when at least the UK got a hold of all this material. It was like Christmas for a philosopher, I think. Before that, you're basically a Kantian or you're not a Kantian. That's simplifying, but, you could basically say what you were and your arguments for that. And that was tautological in itself, because it was saying this is a certain way to think and this is the way to do things. And if you go wrong, if you make a mistake, that's logically inconsistent. But I don't want to do logic. Let's go a different way. That's what I mean. And I think, maybe I am still praising the post-structuralist kind of celebration. I know people like Alain Badiou have criticised a lot of it. Instead looking for the event of truth and commitment and stuff. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. Because I still think the greatest influence...
Haven't seen nothing yet.
The greatest influence... The three biggest influences of what people are doing now. When I look at people like Quantum Meillassoux, Graham Harman, Ray Brazier, Tristan Garcia, all these philosophers that maybe the landscape of contemporary philosophy, when I look at them, it does come from that, still comes from that, you've still got, you needed Wittgenstein, you needed Heidegger, needed Husserl, I think. Mm-hmm. That was they were the precursors of starting to try completely different things, I think. So I think basically what I'm saying is we haven't seen the last of the advocates of that way of thinking. I think there's going to be a much larger, maybe even another canon of thinkers that are going to be wrestling with these ideas, and I think I'm one of them.
Oh dear. I mean, yeah, that sounds great.
Well, no, it's interesting. Which part do you? So, what do you necessarily disagree with then when it comes to the? Because obviously, at the same time, I'm quite an idealist. So, I think the world is mediated through.
You know what? It's not a disagreement, and this actually goes almost to a political vector of patchwork. It's not a disagreement. Mm. It's simply that I'm happy for you to fail elsewhere. Just don't do it within a space that's going to affect my life. Like, I'm absolutely fine with, these ideas interest me at arm's length. I love reading Foucault. I love reading post-structuralists. I enjoy reading Derrida, but I'm not internalizing this into a day-to-day mode of existence, because that's silly, because inherent with all this is the immediate, like, what there is already in their arguments of deconstruction is the potentiality and reality of a dead end. So just, that's why I kind of think, it's super easy to criticize, we've already laughed about him, super easy to criticize people like Peterson, things like Marcus Aurelius, very clear cut. Yeah. Do this, stoicism, do this, do that, and work and have a family. Super easy to criticize that. Seemingly relatively difficult to uphold it within the postmodern culture. So I think that says something in itself. So I think there should be a postmodern structuralist patch, and we'll all watch them not do any work, and I'll enjoy reading their books.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, but I think the point might be more subtle, which is like the level of integration. Because every society and every culture will have a level of alterity or difference that this is fashion. Fashion works perfectly on this, even though it's kind of, there are people that would argue that there's no real new in fashion, it's just a reproduction. But if experimentation can exist and be integrated in a certain way, well, we need that, don't we? Surely the thing that you're affirming has to have some level of creativity in let's say in the hierarchy. So we don't want it to be stale.
Oh yeah, there's got to be difference, but as soon as there's kind of coherent form of difference splits off, when it's still coexisting with a previous form of difference, so you've got two different things, that's where you go, right, okay, well, we need a split. And I'm not saying you can't communicate, you can't react from one another, but to try form a cohesive whole of two continual differences, that's never going to happen. The whole point of patchwork.
Yeah, I think it's the same problem with like the Nietzschean problem, isn't it? Like you kind of get to a dead end and you go, okay, cool. What's this transvaluation of all values? What is the reevaluation of all values? And then you kind of go, well, it doesn't work because you just have one person doing it, and then they become extricated from the society, right? They can't exist if they really want to go as far as, if they want to complete the Nietzschean doctrine, they have to do what Nietzsche actually did in a sense, which is solitude. That's the only way, because then it gives you the illusion that you are doing what you're doing and it's fine. But if you did that within a society, in a social contract or something, it would be problematic. So it takes a more of a mature maybe vision to realize, well, okay, what we need to do is change society generally to become, and then you have to have liberal leanings or whatever leanings you want. My point was simply being, My point would simply be, well, let's look at the topology of that as conceptual agents and neuroses, and let's see it in that sense instead of stable figures of power. And maybe then we're going to learn. I mean, look, if I'm basically just saying, let's be careful when we have our prejudices, and opinions about things, we may just be a ventriloquist for certain desires and that we haven't really thought about. That's quite a simple thing to say, and it's quite a safe thing to say. I think my idea of neurosis is saying this. It's like, let's be careful when we just jump into that desire for X, Y, or Z. We try and observe the mechanisms that's happening there, try and understand the conditions in which why we desire such and such. Like, someone could take that and go massively left with it, couldn't they? Like leftist thing. They can say, well, those conditions are a fake because of capitalism, top bottom technique. We need to go back to society. But I don't have enough time to focus on what those ways of appropriating it would be. I'm just suggesting I'm just suggesting where the battle is, and the battle is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The battle's in the moment where you kind of you realize the futility in the sentence. Why are you watching Game of Thrones? Because I enjoy it. Already within that dynamic is such a height of futility that you go, you know what? I'll just withdraw back to myself, because there's no point. What are you then doing? You're just deconstructing someone else's to you supposed enjoyment, but to them real enjoyment. So you know what? If they want to do it, they want to do it. Fine, okay. I'll go do my own thing. I think there must be a certain sort of like you say, attitude wherein you're self-aware of those things. And as soon as you become self-aware of one's own neurosis, it's kind of slowly starts to kind of mutate. I mean, it's still there.
Well, that's interesting because, if he wants to watch Game of Thrones, no product placement on this. But anyway, if they want to watch Game of Thrones and they like it, but do they like it? Mm-hmm. This is the nagging point.
This is what I'm saying. But then you go, right, well, then for that question, you need the meaning of they, and you need the meaning of like, and you need them in relation to what? Everything. And it's like, well, do you like Game of Thrones is the equivalent of like, well, what the hell's the meaning of life for that person?
I think there's different. I think you can say that if something has been put out with lots of money and force onto a large amount of people, and certain your friends and colleagues are going to watch something, that involves very simple psychological and sociological maneuvers which will make you think you like something. And I think if we go too far down that route that you just said, then we're basically just saying we're condoning, we're saying that mass conformism is okay because they all like to do it. We need to have a level of Frankfurtian kind of critical analysis, and I think the best way to do that is instead of saying something like, you don't really like that because it's a bad show, and I can show that it's a bad show through objective critique or something. Instead of doing all that, just start from the conceptual, okay, what are the conceptual reasons why this is enjoyable, and what are the conditions for this to even be a program and stuff? Maybe that is going a bit too far, but I think if you find out that those conditions are political, which they will be, I guess there's a problem with thinking everything's political and the Schmitt idea, but if you find out that the conditions of jouissance Lacan's a great example. If you find out that the conditions for your pleasure are political, then I do think it's important, and then you are being assimilated by a form of general pleasure which might be painful. And I do believe that there's a capacity. I mean, look, the perfect example is, I'm not saying this is a good thing, but when you're getting people who have devious desires, devious neuroses that separate from the general production of enjoyment through capitalism, sadism, masochism, I don't even know, you could even say anorexia, pedophilia. You can say all these things. I'm not saying these are things that are good, but I'm saying that these are interesting because they're offshoots of something which they don't have conditions within society. They haven't been promoted.
I think this is probably why I'm not looking not looking forward to the next generation of post-structure.
It might be those kind of characters. Well, I'm just saying it exists, isn't it? I'm saying that where is this?
No, yeah, they do exist, and
yes, we want to chop off their head.
Discussion.
That's just going to lead to fascism, isn't it? We've got to be more understanding. And this is why I come from a psychological background, because I do have an enormous amount of sympathy and empathy for people that have been affected by the stubbornness of what is meaningful in a society, and they realise there are conflicts within those meanings. Like, oh, I really, really want to drink loads of champagne all the time and talk to these expensive rich people, but I don't have a job, and they're going to get depressed about that. Or maybe suicidal about that. Yeah. There are problems inherent in all these situations.
Yeah,
I think neurosis is a good way of deconstructing it down. I'm a bit worried though that it becomes. I'm worried that I'd be relativizing everyone's feelings into just simply, well, you have that neurosis, you have that thought, because what happens is you have to separate yourself from those thoughts. And then the thoughts aren't quite yours. They're just these things floating around. That's not going to help.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to mention? I don't feel like that's
not really. No. I just think maybe just generally trying to stop neurosis from being a derogatory term is my achievement. Which was what I'm trying to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps you just need to go the Heidegger route and create new language. What's new? Neuroticism change when it comes into contact with Dasein, because Dasein is inherently an inherently different concept. Perhaps that's where neuroticism needs to begin its new semantic becoming. It can't do it within. What we know as human history, because it's too steep. You say, oh, he's a bit neurotic, she's a bit neurotic. That's almost that's assumed derogatory.
Yeah, exactly. And then what happens if we look at our history, we look at the greatest figures of our history, and we know that they have this trait in them, this obsession for greater things, this obsession to always outdo themselves, the obsession for rigor, for detail. Yet we don't dare point at it and say neuroticism. Well, that's just lying, isn't it? What else is it then? Because we don't live. What I'm saying is, we don't live in an age anymore where we are. What's the word? We are pushed into or influenced by the good, the Christian idea of good, or even the old philosophical idea of truth. These aren't engines anymore for us making work.
No.
So we've got to really ask serious questions of why when we do intellectual and creative work, why we do them. The first answer, which is still quite not honest, but it's not enough, is to say something like a Freudian idea, which is, well, we have an ego, we wish to have and a Lacanian idea, we wish to be validated in the social realm, but that's still not ontological enough, is it? Because that's contingent on different histories. So we need to understand the ontological factor of what makes us want to do these authentic projects. And I still think neurosis is by far the best answer we've got so far. I know you might not believe that, so silence is good.
No. Oh, I think it's a good direction towards an answer, and that seems like a good place to finish up.